My name's Damien Carrick. I'm the presenter of a program called The Law Report, which is the legal current affairs show on ABC Radio National. Welcome to the Wheeler Centre and welcome to this evening's conversation. It's part of a series of 4 discussions titled So Who the Bloody Hell Are We? All national identities around the world are built on the stories people tell themselves about who they think they are. Well, what are the defining characteristics that make up and shape the Australian identity? We have concepts like mateship, larrikin spirit, the battler, the cry of no worries. Do these ideas genuinely reflect a unique Australian way of dealing with people? Or are they meaningless? Are they outdated? Are they self-serving? Our conversation this evening is going to explore perhaps the most widely held and the most cherished characteristic of them all, the idea of the fair go. Is there a myth more pervasive than that of egalitarian Australia, a country where mates look out for one another and good, honest, hard work is rewarded in a land of opportunity? When we look at the achievements of our country, we tend to look at them through the prism of concepts like the fair go. I guess the idea is that our fundamental sense of fairness is what has made these achievements possible. But do we also do the same for our national failures and our national shortcomings? How well has the concept of the fair go served Indigenous Australians, women, workers, refugees? We're not going to have a black armband attack on our national self-image tonight, but we are going to have an honest, frank conversation about how this idea of the fair go plays out both in our national imagination and also in the practical outcomes experienced by all Australians. To share their thoughts, we're joined this evening by 4 people who think an awful lot about whether or not the lucky country is lucky for everyone. David Manne is a lawyer and migration agent. He's the Executive Director of the Refugee and Immigration Legal Centre. He's worked in various capacities assisting refugees and asylum seekers for over 16 years. Melissa Lucashenko is an award-winning novelist and essayist. She lives between Brisbane and the Bundjalung Nation, and she writes extraordinary books about the extraordinary lives of people on the margins of Australian society, women, Aboriginal people and the poor. Professor Stuart Macintyre is the Ernest Scott Professor of History and a Laureate Professor at the University of Melbourne. And Monica Dux is a Melbourne writer. She's published widely on women's issues, and in 2008 she co-authored the book The Great Feminist Denial. Historian Stuart Macintyre, I'd like to start with you. Can you describe the idea of the fair go? What does it mean?
Well, I think the fair go in its original meaning meant that everybody should have a fair shot. The phrase itself originates in Britain, sometimes fair go, sometimes fair goes. It takes root here quite quickly, so that, for instance, it's commonly associated with two-up, to make sure the pennies are tossed properly. And it becomes quite a popular notion here, partly, and I'm not sure I followed this, but I think it's usually suggested that it takes root in Australia because this is a society in which you don't have hereditary privilege and in which there is a strong egalitarian ethos. So the idea of a fair go, by the end of the 19th century, was quite a widespread colloquialism.
So that idea that we're a new world without hereditary privilege, we're convicts, we're immigrants, we're people who look at each other's qualities rather than each other's position or status.
And we take exception to when people have an inside run. Yeah.
Has it been a rallying call, a powerful idea, a potent tool when people have argued for their rights?
I think its sort of most notable expression in Australian arrangements would probably be with industrial relations. As the result of legislation that said that employers could get protection so long as they paid a fair and reasonable wage, H.B. Higgins, who was the president of the Arbitration Court in 1907, laid down minimum wage standards based on family needs for male workers. And that is, I think, taken as cementing the notion of a fair go in Australia's social arrangements.
So it's more than a pop culture slogan. It's something which is perhaps entrenched in our laws and our institutions and our understanding of ourselves.
Or at least people make an effort to define it institutionally, yeah. Monica
Dux, what do you think of this idea of a fair go? Has it been a useful one for women?
No. I think it's interesting you've always got to ask with the fair go, like the fair go for whom. And, you know, women in general, I think some women have profited from this kind of egalitarian myth, but in the main, when I think of fair go, I think, you know, this is some kind of blokey, white, Anglo-Australian myth of what it is to be part of the nation. And like Stuart says, it actually does have quite a rich history, the term. But, you know, even when you mention like two-up, and I think I would never ever have been allowed into a two-up game 50 years ago. And the harvester judgment, which is quite interesting because that is often cited, if you're on one side of the team, in saying, well, it got the male basic wage, which was very revolutionary internationally, and isn't this fantastic? And a man could suddenly support his family. But women and Indigenous workers were completely shut out of that. In fact, it kind of legislated against equal pay. And, yeah, so I think there's always a flip side to the fair go. It sounds good, and sometimes it has operated in a way that does benefit certain sections of the community, but you've got to kind of look underneath it and see who's losing in that.
Foundation myths of all nations, I mean, I'm thinking of the rugged individualism of the USA. I'm thinking of liberty, equality and fraternity for the French, fraternity brotherhood, yeah?
Yeah.
So they're all... Well, yeah, she's kind of... Yeah, depends how you want to read that. I mean, you know, that... yeah.
Well, it's very... I mean, I think Australia has a very blokey mateship history that is very masculine. I mean, if you go back to Gallipoli, the Gallipoli myth, before the Gallipoli myth, often Australia was represented by a woman. After the Gallipoli myth, you will never see Australia represented by a woman, or indeed anyone else who is not this kind of... this male, and I think we do have very blokey myths.
You'd think more so than the rugged individualism of the USA, or that
yeah, I think it's different.
Fraternity brotherhood idea of the French.
I mean, it is different, but I do think Australia is far more blokey. Yeah, we're kind of you know, the 1950s, Russell Ward, the kind of the Australian legend, and he was the bloke on the horse, and this is our character. And whenever we have discussions about the Australian character, and even this week, 2 of the sessions are about, you know, something that's very masculine. We've had, you know, the other day. Anne Summers and the panel basically talking about masculinity. And today we're talking about the fair go, which I think, and mateship, that comes from a very male idea. So, yeah.
Melissa Lucashenko, do you think the fair go is a concept that is unique to European Australians, or do you think other cultures, including Indigenous Australians, and there are many cultures within that, have similar concepts which they hold close to their hearts?
Yeah, well, I find it curious, I suppose, the way mainstream Australia, I won't say white Australia, I'll say mainstream Australia approaches this idea of itself in this capacity for doublethink that exists in Australian history and in mainstream Australia today. This idea that the fair go underpins so much of Australian society, when that is transparently not the case. You know, if you look at any statistics on migrants, on the poor, on Aboriginal people, any statistic you care to mention, the fair go just flies out the window in a kind of panic attack of you know, God forbid that I should hang around where these statistics lie. And yet you put that up against a history here of, I don't know how many thousand, we can't say 60 or 80,000, but however many thousands of years where egalitarianism was actually practiced as opposed to spouted by politicians and blokes in pubs before they go home to beat their wives. Societies where two tenets underpinned Aboriginal law, the 2 Aboriginal commandments, if you like. Be kind and do not steal. You know, that's our version of the fair go, and we actually had it. And Captain Cook said that he saw it in Cooktown. He said, these are the happiest people upon the face of the earth.
Has the Anglo-Australian or mainstream Australian concept of the fair go, Has it been a useful concept for Indigenous Australians in their fight for rights? Has it been a useful catch cry or slogan that they've been able to use in their fight?
I think there's a kind of sentimental attachment to the idea by parts of mainstream Australia who don't like to see an underdog kicked. But I think also that there's a very strong undercurrent in Australian life of if someone is poor, if someone's struggling, if someone's demonised or marginalised in some way, it must be their fault. They must have done something wrong, so let's blame the victim. And blackfellas have always been, you know, caught up in that. And so for us, I don't think of it as the fair go, I think of it as the white go.
Literally the fair go, as in fair colour.
Advance Australia fair. To me, it means skin. I don't know historically if that has any validity for others, but for us, Advance Australia fair means advance white people. You know, the fair go is the white go. You know, and it's not just historical. The median Aboriginal income in Australia today, or let me put it like this, think of how much your income is. Think of how much money you make per year. All right? You should have a figure in your head probably. Now, take 60% of that. That's the Aboriginal. If you were Aboriginal, you would be making 60% of what you make. All right? And if people want to know why we're dying 17 years earlier than other Australians, if people want to know why we're 2% of the population and make up 25% of the prison population in Australia, think about living on 60% of your income, or a median of $287 a week, for the rest of your life. You know, that's our version of the fair go.
David Manne, you're a refugee lawyer. A lot of this discussion is about who is inside and outside the tent, who is worthy of a fair go. Does the idea or the concept extend to non-Australians or to new Australians? I mean, on an individual level, it could be argued that Australians are very welcoming to newcomers. What do you reckon?
Well, what I reckon is that part of the idea of a fair go, in a sense, and it was sort of evoked recently, there was recent evocation by the Prime Minister in her Australia Day speech, and she referred in part to it meaning or referring to equality and respect for all. And that got me thinking, because I thought that really one of the real marks of equality and respect for all is actually whether we comply with fundamental human rights, for all people in this country, including newcomers. How do we welcome them? How do we deal with them when they turn up? Not seeking a new job as migrants, not settling, as the Prime Minister referred to her Welsh parents, but in more difficult circumstances. And I think that's often the real mark of how we're going. And the reality is this, that I think that when we're talking about fundamental human rights, one of the most important rights is liberty. And if we want to talk about liberty at the moment, the reality, there's an immense chasm between the rhetoric and the reality, because the fact is, as we sit here now, that there are over 6,000 people around Australia being held indefinitely, incarcerated, who have committed no crime, in many respects have fled from hideous human rights crimes, and yet are being held indefinitely in clear contravention of human rights standards. One of them being that it's ordinarily, under international human rights law, necessary for a government to justify, on the basis of necessity, why someone should be detained. There is absolutely no effort at the moment by this government to do so, and there's no effort by this government to explain, for example, why in recent times 1,000 of those people have been children.
You've got to fight to change. You want to fight to change policy, and I guess you need to address government, and you also need to address public opinion. In both of those fights, do you argue the fair go? Do you use that concept of fairness in your arguments, in trying to further your agenda?
Certainly do, but I don't think it's always resonated. And I think one of the real problems here is that is in a sense partly deeply rooted in our history, and that is that the history of immigration policy in this country has in many respects been one quite antithetical to the idea of a fair go, because it's actually been in many respects about treating people, even sanctioned by the Constitution and the aliens powers under the Constitution, essentially permitting Parliament to treat people differently if they come from somewhere else. And if they're not Australian citizens. And I think that it's a very difficult thing that's both deeply rooted in our sort of history, but also, and therefore what I'm talking about really is that it's a very inward-looking, in a sense, a very inward-looking concept. It doesn't reach out beyond our borders, in a sense, and I think it needs to. But part of the problem also relates to something, I guess, more contemporary, and that is boats. For example, if I can use that issue, it's very difficult to argue a fair go at the moment. I think when I think a lot of the sort of public consciousness of boats and people arriving on them is actually about rule breaking.
Well, they must have done something wrong because they're suffering.
I think that a lot of the consideration around the problems that people have with people coming by boat in Australia is around the concept that people are somehow breaking a rule by doing so, or if I could use the sort of the indelicate language, or the rhetoric of the political rhetoric, queue jumping. Queue jumping is about rule breaking, and the sort of perverse irony here is really that most of those coming here by boat seeking asylum are in fact not breaking a rule. They're actually asserting a right that they have under international law. Every person has a right to seek and enjoy asylum from persecution under international law and under treaties that we've signed.
That's, I guess, the black letter law version.
Yeah.
Stuart Macintyre, this idea of the fair go, is it based on, I don't know, you want to extend pity or charity towards people, or is it in traditional Aussie culture an idea of you're entitled to respect because of who you are?
Well, I think it's both. I suppose one of the things I'd say about the fair go is that as a sort of a claim, its meaning changes in different times and different contexts. One of the instances that strikes me at the moment, I'm doing a study of post-war reconstruction, Australia during and after the Second World War. And it's quite remarkable that as a result of the wartime effort, they impose rationing of clothing and food. So you'll get coupons for so many clothes a year and half a pound of butter a week and so on. And it is remarkably popular. Indeed, the early public opinion polls suggest that people would like to extend it to other commodities. And the idea of an equality of sacrifice at a time of national need. Now, I'm not idealising the Australian national community during the Second World War. This is a time when they're interning enemy aliens, and although Aboriginal workers are enrolled in Northern Australia into the war effort and given better conditions than they had before the war, they're still not treated as equals.
Aboriginal soldiers were taking part in the war, of course, and being treated better than they'd ever been treated at home.
And also for the Allied Works Council. And I suppose that the question really is, when we talk about the fair go, it arises in different contexts, and it always postulates a particular moral community. And in doing so, it excludes some to include others. But I do think it has some resonance. And I do think that in many movements to overcome discrimination or oppression or disadvantage, an appeal to fairness is a very prominent one.
Isn't it, though? It's about largesse to me. It's like if the powers that be, if you beseech them for largesse to give us a fair go, please, to me it has that flavour to it. And as soon as you start talking about a rights-based agenda, as David's talking, bang, the shutters go up and you have to take it to the courts and you have to go to the streets and you have to fight in a very, very different way, and the fair go runs screaming.
Yeah, I think that quite often the appeal for a fair go is not to an authority, it's for establishing the moral legitimacy in the population at large. I mean, I'm quite struck, for instance, by the way in which the fight for equal pay, these days it's often articulated in terms for the benefit of the enterprise of tapping female expertise, but in the 1940s and 50s it's argued very much in terms of fairness. And it's a sort of a discourse that is sometimes directed towards the decision makers, but in a democratic society is equally pitched at citizens.
it is interesting, though. I think what you were saying, Melissa, really resonates for me. And when I was looking today, I Googled the fair go. 12,000 hits in 24 hours. Mm. And, you know, I thought, well, this is it's bandied around a lot. Like, it's a very diluted term. And, you know, you hear it all the time. And it is used quite often. But it is either used as, you know, from what I can see, as patriotic kind of, you know, nationalistic twat, kind of people saying we're a nation of the fair go, we're great, or it's used by people who are dispossessed, marginalised, and saying, can't we have a piece of this? Can't we have a fair go? It is. I think that's quite true. It's these two ways that it seems to be used today. Is either people saying we're not getting a fair go. That doesn't mean they're going to get one if they're going to use this. It's kind of appropriating that nationalistic jingoism, I guess.
I suppose the reason I couched it in institutional terms is that we today still and historically have always been up against laws and governments. Yes. Yeah. And sometimes individuals at the community level, you know, often, but primarily it's been institutional racism, and then that flows down and is expressed by people at the grassroots level. No,
I'd agree with you. Although I think, for instance, in the 67 referendum, ideas of a fair go are very powerful. And they're pitched at the electorate.
Yeah, and 10% of Australians chose not to vote yes.
Higher
in some rural areas, obviously.
Now, David Manne before mentioned Julia Gillard's 2011 Australia Day speech. In that speech at the Adelaide Town Hall, Julia Gillard spoke of her experience as an immigrant and as a woman, and of the opportunities she had enjoyed in this country and the opportunities she had seized through hard work. She also spoke of the sense of community spirit that she witnessed in the Queensland floods, and she also spoke of her determination to uphold the idea of egalitarian Australia. Quote, "To make sure that Australia is a place where demography is not destiny and where success in life is defined by preparedness to work hard, not by where you were born or what your parents did." Stuart, what did you make of the speech?
I didn't hear the speech, but I did look at it in preparation for tonight, and I was struck by the way in which her understanding of the fair go is essentially one of an egalitarianism of opportunity and what I'd call an egalitarianism of manners. Opportunity so that everybody should have a chance, and that's, I think many of us here would have great reservations about whether there is equality of opportunity where we see widening inequalities that are reproduced by a number of means, not least in education, but other social institutions. An egalitarianism of manners is the idea that in Australia we paper over divisions by treating each other ostensibly as if we're all on the same footing. And both of those are quite, I think, resonant themes in the Australian ethos, but I don't find either of them, I'm not disparaging them, I don't think either of them quite encompass what the fair go could mean.
I've got a question for Monica and Melissa. Well, actually, first of all, I mean, I've got a couple of questions for you, but Melissa, first of all, you live in Queensland. That idea of working together to face the devastation wrought by the floods and the storms, the idea of mateship and a fair go, collectively working together to overcome problems and challenges. Did that speak to you, that element?
I actually live in Logan City, so I wasn't personally affected by the floods. I think people did come together in a time of crisis in Brisbane, which is not far from where I live, and faced with a natural disaster, they did show compassion for one another, did start to treat each other decently, like human beings should treat each other. And I guess my short response is that I find it telling that it takes a natural disaster of that proportions for Australians to do that, when in my culture that's the way you're raised. That's the way you treat people, because they're people, not because they've got money or a certain colour skin.
And this is a question for both Melissa and Monica. You're both feminists. You must see something valuable in the rise of our first female Prime Minister and in her use of the language of the fair go and in this speech?
I just saw that. I mean, it's worth looking up if you haven't heard this speech, because I was quite astounded by it, because it was page after page of, I didn't see it live, of just nationalistic jingos. And I don't see that as coming from a woman's mouth first. I see that as coming from a politician's mouth who is appealing to the electorate by saying we're all Aussies and we're all in it together. What I find quite astounding when she was talking about, the disasters that have been occurring is she's actually talking about something that's quite human. We should be aspiring to help our neighbour. We should be aspiring to, be there for each other. But when you kind of wrap it up as a special Australian characteristic, you're really kind of speaking bullshit, I reckon. I mean, I was interested in the Christchurch earthquake recently. I saw on the telly, I don't know if it was the mayor or some, spokesperson standing up and saying exactly the same kind of thing. This is this is a national characteristic of us New Zealanders. And I think you go to America with Katrina, you would find the same rhetoric being used. And I think once you actually start bringing in all this nationalism, I think it's just a bit infantilising, and it kind of degrades what we're talking about. We're talking about people helping each other rather than, you're suddenly drawing national borders.
But isn't it legitimate to try and have the conversation in using the concepts which are commonly understood and try and engage people in that way? The concepts she was using are they're jingos. We're all mates. And Changi, she mentions Changi, and and I thought, and also, and it's great. She says, okay, we've moved past the welfare state and we've moved past this simplistic mateship. I find it quite moved past the idea of this being just about male bonding
but of course we haven't, because she's using those terms which are very exclusive. It's interesting, I thought, that in '99 with the referendum for the Republic, and John Howard in the preamble was insisting that we had mateship, and there was a real outcry about it, and for good reason, because people were saying, I don't feel that that's me, and I don't feel I belong to that term. And now, we see our Prime Minister in 2011 just regurgitating that kind of language. I just don't think it really, if she'd stood up and said, look at the problems we have, look at the things we need to face as a nation, that's inspiring. But she's not. She's standing up saying, we're all great. Isn't it great? It doesn't really help anyone, does it?
Well, I agree with that. This sort of Australian or un-Australian talk it has a couple of things for me about it that, and one of them really Monica's hit on, and I just don't know what it means really. It almost, all of a sudden, I almost think, does that mean that other countries don't do this either? I mean,
they don't help each other in Japan.
Maybe we need to go and do some workshops with them about caring about others when there's disasters, or I don't know. I find that it's leading. Burden. It's leading down that potential insidious road of nationalism, where we define ourselves by what we're not, or in opposition to others. But the thing that I mentioned before, I'd like to come back to briefly too, and that is something that struck me very powerfully, was the inward-looking nature of that speech, and the fact that that at a time when you'd think that some of the great challenges of our time really are about working within the region and globally, looking at global humanity. And about fairness to others globally, climate change, refugees, etc. It was almost completely absent. So if we talk about an evocation of a fair go, what it is to treat people with equality and respect, including our neighbours in the region on questions, complex questions of refugees and asylum, climate change, etc. It was absent, and that troubled me greatly, because I really think that if we're to if we're to develop the idea of a fair go and fairness to all, as is the rhetoric, I think that the reality needs to be we need to move beyond our borders. We need to export that idea in our own minds and in reality.
But all arguments, all debates, all agendas, they're battles of ideas, and you can use ideas to further those agendas. I mean, I've got to tell you, I've got to front up here. I found that speech really interesting because I had two simultaneous responses to it. Part of me was going, oh, that's a bit jingoistic, and part of me was going, that's quite moving. And I really loved her descriptions of the people in Queensland, and I found that very moving. And I guess I'm going to ask you, are we being too hard on this idea of the fair go? And are we being perhaps too hard? I mean, because I think you can be hard on all ideas. I mean, a fair go, but equally feminism, Indigenous rights, multiculturalism, workers' rights, all big ideas can be used to privilege one group or to subvert others. And I mean, Melissa, I guess let me ask you this. I mean, for instance, in dysfunctional Indigenous communities, some men can argue that traditional culture or Indigenous rights can give them the right to suppress women. And we don't ever then, or we shouldn't ever then throw out the idea of Indigenous rights or a right to traditional culture. We simply argue the point. We use the ideas and then we argue them. Can we also do the same with the fair go rather than throwing it in the dustbin?
Well, there's a distinction to be made between traditional culture on the one hand and Indigenous rights on the other. Indigenous rights is an artefact, a linguistic artefact of the Western legal system. Traditional culture is a whole different set of practices and beliefs and religious philosophies, some of which in some areas oppress women, in other areas do nothing of the sort. A lot of what is spoken about as traditional culture is actually bullshit. An academic called Audrey Bolger did some excellent work in the Northern Territory in the 80s, and she said Aboriginal women live with three kinds of law. They live with white man's law, they live with Aboriginal law, and they live with bullshit law, which is humbug, men pretending to exercise culture when all they're exercising is their testosterone. But if we go to the concept of I'll call it the rare go rather than the white go. The rare go, of course, egalitarianism, because it's a fundamental tenet of my culture as an Aboriginal person, and it's a fundamental alleged tenet of my culture as an Australian, I'm going to support that. I think egalitarianism is to be fostered, and the best expression I've ever heard of it is an Aboriginal friend of mine saying to her young child, "Hey, look out, what are you doing?" Because one of the kids had lollies. "You got two in your hand and he's got none in his hand. What are you doing?" And that was it, from a very young age. Two in your hand, none in his hand. What's going on? That's not right. And we can foster that, but we've got to be real about it. It's no good spouting the robotic Julia Gillard spouting on about it at Australia Day while there's 1,000 children locked in detention centres, while Cameron Doomadgee's being kicked to death by a copper on Palm Island, while Kevin Spratt's being tasered and having his shoulder dislocated in Perth. Let's get real.
David?
Well, I think that one thing that needs to happen, I do think I agree that egalitarianism is something that we ought to support and to foster, and I think that it is worthwhile trying to, as much as possible, if the fair go is to remain part of our nation's sort of consciousness, and to try to actually ensure that it in part does serve others who have been excluded or are being excluded. But I mean, one of the real questions for me is whether, in the immigration and particularly in the refugee area, what's essentially happened is that many of the golden threads of our standards and legal system have just been sort of excluded. So access to the rule of law for decision making. I mean, really fundamental things: anti-discrimination laws, habeas corpus. These sort of access to legal assistance. I mean, these sort of basic fundamental issues, which I think are part of a fair go. I think that they are critical parts of a fair go, and then you develop that and talk about fundamental human rights. Those matters, there needs to be in any proper reform or reimagination of it, it needs to include those beyond our borders, as I've said, and it has to reach out beyond those sort of white Australians, if you like, that it was it was first founded on, that idea, I think. So that's really where I see it needing to head.
We can develop a concept of ourselves as Australians, as people that care about others, that people know how to act as decent human beings. And, that's, I think, what David's talking about.
Can I just add to it something that's very troubling to me, that if it is one of the key sort of ideas in our consciousness, that and yet it doesn't serve many people who've come from other countries or Indigenous people, take people from other countries. If you just look at the amount of people that since 1945, since the Second World War, there have been 7 million people. 7 million people have settled in Australia, and we are a nation of migrants, as is often said. And multiculturalism is again being revived. If it's to have any meaning, it needs to take account of these matters. It actually needs to be responsive. The fair go idea needs to be responsive to that reality. Otherwise, we live with a really fundamental disconnect where it just doesn't speak to or serve many people.
Oh, I think that's part of the problem. Like, if you're going to compare, say, the fair go and say, well, this is egalitarianism with, say, movements like feminism or Indigenous rights, is the fair go is something that's it's so ephemeral. There's no fair go movement. There hasn't been a school of fair go-ness. It's a cliche. Well, not yet. Maybe tonight's the night. But it is. It's essentially a cliche that's quite simplistic rhetoric about some lovely ideal. Now, if you look at something like, I guess, my interest in feminism. Feminism is a very broad movement. It's not monolithic. Feminists never agree with each other. It's very diverse, it's very dynamic, it's very evolving. It's actually something that moves forward and it is often in disagreement. When you compare that to, the fair go, where do we go from there?
If it wasn't powerful, it wouldn't be used. If it didn't do what it did for Damien and tug at the heartstrings a bit, unless it's glaringly and obviously offensive to you because you've never gotten sweet FA out of it, if it didn't pull those heartstrings, if it wasn't powerful, they wouldn't be using it.
But that's why it's like a tranquiliser. I think when I read Gillard's speech, I thought it does. It's a national tranquiliser.
But I think beyond the superficial allure of it and the power of it is that dark reality. So I agree. I think it actually does mean something.
Oh, it's very appealing because we all want to belong and we all want a nation. And I remember as a teenager when I was reading her speech, I was thinking in the 80s, and that feeling of I'm an Aussie, and we all kind of, that makes us feel good. We want to belong, but then like Melissa was saying earlier, you scratch the surface and there's a whole other world there,
But I don't know. I mean, I can see how it is purloined for purposes of national bombast. Although I haven't done a Google and I haven't seen the context. I'd want to draw a distinction between movements and concepts such as feminism or egalitarianism and socialism, for that matter, and the fair go. The fair go, I mean, most powerful social movements have to translate their principles into an idiom that is popularly accessible. And fair go is one term in that idiom. It's not as if it trumps all others, and it's not as if it doesn't get misused and barnacled. But nevertheless, I wouldn't want to give up on the underlying principle of the fair go. That'd be my response to that.
Can I ask you a question, myself, on this? Yeah. It relates to you being moved by Gillard's speech in part, but someone recently in public, someone who speaks on refugees publicly used a term about refugees trying to sort of, in a sense, develop the fair go idea for refugees and called people coming by boat fed income refugees. Does that work for you? No. Does it? It didn't work for me. I just have to say, it didn't sort of transpose for me. It didn't resonate.
It's too contrived, isn't it? I mean, I think some
words. It might not be for the great unwatched.
Words such as mateship or mate or battler have been hopelessly, I think, exhausted by the uses to which they've been put. I don't think of fair go as having been particularly exploited in that way. I mean, less so than those others. And fair dinkum is, particularly painful, isn't it? But I mean, it's always struck me when media management is in full dealing with new arrivals. You can recall the Tampa thing. At all costs, you have to keep them from being identified as people. You have to keep journalisms away so we can put names, faces and stories to them, because once you do that, people's attitudes will change. Now, that's not necessarily to do with the fair go, but it has to do, I think, with the way in which people respond to human circumstances rather than they do towards abstractions.
Yeah, contact.
And that comes back to leadership in a way. I'm reminded, because I'm in Melbourne, of... who's heard of William Cooper?
Oh, yeah.
3 or 4 people in the audience. William Cooper was a... I can't remember his language group. He was a global political actor in 1930 38 or 39, 38. And he lived on a mission, I think he lived in Melbourne by that stage, Aboriginal elder, very well-respected man. And in 1938 or 39, when Kristallnacht happened, he was the only person on the planet who made a personal protest to the German consul in Melbourne about the treatment of Jews in Germany. The only person on the planet, and that was because his culture, his upbringing in Aboriginal law told him that there is a way to treat people and there's a way to be a prick and a bastard and a politician. He was a leader, a real leader of men and of women, and that's what we're lacking. We're lacking people with the intestinal fortitude to stand up and say, we won't lock up children, we won't accept Aboriginal men being kicked to death in Palm Island, we won't accept the kinds of poverty that we see in parts of Australia. It's not that hard, you know, it just takes someone with a bit of guts.
Let's move the conversation to, is it possible to reimagine this concept of the fair go in what you would regard as a meaningful way? Is it something that can be reappropriated or made real?
I'll say yes. I'll say yes, that there's enough in the phrase that can be dredged up and expanded upon, and that with real intent, with real commitment to treat people fairly and well, that the phrase can be reclaimed, that it could be reclaimed. And as I said at the beginning, you know, we're starting on a tradition that's not 200 years old, that's several thousand years old.
Yeah, I do too, because I actually think some of the content of a fair go is incredibly compelling, and you know, will always be relevant, treating people with respect and equality, all people, and that sort of that egalitarian spirit, I think, are very attractive. I just, you know, I've said it, so I won't say much more about it. But I think that in reimagining it just needs to move beyond our borders. And it's a really critical time to do that. So, for example, if you take the sort of just the neighbourhood principle, if people come to our country from somewhere else, a fair go should also extend to them, in the sense that they're on our doorstep, they're they're neighbours now. They've reached us. They need our help. Rather than what actually is happening, and that is that almost none of the important principles or qualities that were referred to by Gillard in her speech actually apply to asylum seekers when they come here at the moment, in terms of their treatment. But there are other matters that are of deep importance in the region and globally about global humanity at the moment, which could well be applied in our approach, and so I think that yes is the answer.
Monica?
Yeah, I mean, it's a lovely idea, and it is. And I can see, you know, why you may have shed a tear for Gillard's speech. No, and good. I'm glad you did. But no, it's very seductive. But I think the problem with something like this is it has such a history in Australia of being appropriated and being used in this mateshipy way that if we can separate it, then that's fantastic. But I don't know if this terminology. I mean, I know Stuart, you're saying that you think it's still quite fresh, maybe, but I still feel the weight of how easily it's co-opted to basically whitewash, you know, what's really going on. So I think more than a fair go, we should be looking more at, you know, the hard truths of Australia and talking about them rather than kind of dressing it up a little bit, which I think the fair go can naturally quite easily do.
Well, I suppose, one of the points about colloquialism is that they keep changing their meaning, and so we can't prescribe a definition of a fair go, and it's used in ways that I find unpersuasive or unwelcome. But I do think as a sort of a way of articulating an ethical principle, yes, I'd want to support it.
How?
I think it's introduced when people begin to discuss circumstances. Then the appeal to a fair go is generally understood between the speaker and the listener. I think that's where it operates. It operates as if you're like a touchstone of what would be fair in a particular circumstance.
Just interestingly, when When the current government promised a couple of years ago that it would fundamentally reform detention policy in this country, a promise that's been betrayed fundamentally, it actually interestingly, in the speech that the then Minister Chris Evans made, which is essentially the policy of that speech, a number of the references in that speech were indeed drawing upon, I think, in a broad sense, notions of a fair go, of treating people in a civilised way, fairly, decently. So there was a lot of talk about that, and also not dehumanising people, about recognising their basic humanity. So, you know, unfortunately that hasn't been implemented, that policy, it's been abandoned, but I do think there are opportunities actually with leadership, and it does need leadership, to actually draw upon those principles. It may not be about drawing upon them by saying, you know, give refugees a fair go. I can't see the Prime Minister standing up and doing that immediately at this point, but you know, maybe down the track. But certainly drawing upon some of the principles, I think, is very, very much possible.
Mm.